At this hour, we will be interviewing author Jody Lynn Nye. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you.
I'm your interviewer, Bill Fawcett, and we're going to be talking with Jody about her books and her upcoming book, which is a Ring of Fire novel being written with Eric. So why don't we start with that? What should they look forward to in the upcoming book? What's it going to be about?
I have a young lady whose sheep farm, actually the estate containing many sheep farms and weaver establishments in the Midlands of Great Britain, and she is an independent young woman. She will have been of service to the uptimers by the time the novel that we're working on comes around, and she is going to move British manufacturing forward, in one case 100 years, and in the other case almost 400. So it's going to be fun.
And how is she doing that?
Well, you've probably read about the Aqualators, and they're going to be a fundamental part of how she's going to move her family's fortunes forward. In the period that the 1632 universe explores, the British wool trade, which was the crown jewel for many, many years, was starting to fade in favor of cheaper wool cloth from the continent. So what she's trying to do is rescue that and bring it back forward by introducing must-have fabrics for the aristocracy. Because in this period, they were already having velvets and silks and incredible embroidery and knitted fabrics that you would never look at and say that they were knitted. Instead they look like oil paintings. Incredibly beautiful, very complex work. And what's a poor girl to do whose family's fortunes comes off the back of their sheep? So she's starting to move forward in that direction. But there's a twist, naturally. And what she starts out to do is not necessarily what she's going to end up doing. And we're going to have fun exploring that. The people that she meets, the changes in her life and the lives of the people that depend upon her and her father's family. He's the local squire. He's a good man, but and he's not even particularly set in his ways, but he's trodden down by taxes, particularly taxes. They were very, very hard in this time. And just the responsibility of keeping so many people, keeping them afloat, making sure that everybody gets fed, making sure that the animals are cared for. He's a good man. He truly cares about the land. But Margaret, his daughter, is a very forward thinker. And in a way, she's almost like an adopted uptimer.
Well, you're actually introducing, I believe, in these a uptime concept, but using per the period and unique to that area method of it being built.
Yes, indeed. The Aqualators run on water. They're very slow compared with modern computers, but they're better than anything that exists in the 17th century. So
the oscillator is a computer?
Yes, it is. It's a form of computer. It's sort of a binary drip tray, if you will, that creates a code-like pattern. And that means that she can calculate and produce things in a fashion that has been unknown as of yet. And for this, in order to produce enough Aqualators, she needs to start the potteries up about 100 years sooner than they would have under other circumstances.
Pottery?
The potteries. That part of the Midlands of Staffordshire is where Wedgwood and many of the other famous potteries are situated. But most of them got started in the 18th century. But the fact is that wonderful slip clay, the incredibly fine china clay, there are huge deposits of it there. It's a natural resource for them. But once they realize what possible applications it has, it's going to be really interesting.
So you're introducing effectively a period computer into World
Well,
of Ring
yes,
of Fire.
adapted from things that the uptimers in Grantville are already doing.
Okay. Um, how did you said she met him? Isn't that in one of the earlier books that she's already met them, or what? How does she meet
It's
uptimers?
it's side fiction. That these stories will be provided probably in the Grantville Gazette of her actually meeting the uptimers for the first time and her first adventure with them. So those will not appear in a canon book, but they will appear in canon, as many stories have. There's a good deal of side fiction that is available, and it's worth people's looking into if they have not already done so. The books themselves, there are expanding every year. The what started out as one novel has become, I think, 40 or so, and many side stories, many side novellas that have been produced, and they will tell the beginning of Margaret's association with the uptimers.
Is um, having read your notes, I'm cheating here. We probably ought to make an admission, by the way. I'm Mr. Jody Nye in real world. We're married.
Yes, a
Um,
stranger whom I have never seen before.
yes, yes. Hello. um, the um, place where they meet has already been portrayed in one of the earlier books, though, hasn't it?
Yes, I'd rather not quite give that away because it's going to be a lot of fun and I want people to read it and enjoy it.
Okay, okay. But some colorful characters for sure.
Mhm.
What do you need to become a Ring of Fire writer and start writing in it, other than the fact that you're doing it with Eric, so that sort of guarantees things. What does one need to learn and study, and what did you do to prep entering this universe for the first time?
You need to study the period. Things changed very rapidly over this era, that moving from one king to another, from everything changed when Grantville appeared in the midst of it all, but the bones of it were still there. So it behooves one to read up about that period, that there was a great deal of invention going on. The Renaissance was happening around them. The characters, Shakespeare has already been and died, poor man. And it's a wonderful period of exploration, of invention, art, music, philosophy. And yet so many people were living far, far below what Americans think of as the poverty line. It's dire for them that people were in the midst of war, that they had parasites, that they lived with disease all their lives. They had very short lives, most of them. And Grantville is doing its best. New the new United States, the United States of Europe, is doing its best to raise the standard of living for everybody. And by introducing one innovation after another, but you need to understand the mindset of the time, which was very different than it is now, in the same way that Rome is a foreign concept to those people. I have many books on the period. Some of the annals that were written around the time. Contemporary accounts are almost always the best information that you can have. But there's a wonderful woman named Ruth Goodman who writes books because she about how people lived during that period, because she has gone to the trouble of living like that to see what it was like. And they're phenomenal pieces of resource for anybody who wants to know what it was like to be Victorian, an Elizabethan, a Tudor. And there are many others. I have quite a shelf of things like that. A book on the wool trade. I have several books on the wool trade, on money at the time. And the relationship between the countries was ever changing, because as people are convinced to cooperate with the United States of Europe and with King Gustav of Sweden, there's a lot of different thoughts going on. So if you want to be a Ring of Fire author, start reading series, read as many as you possibly can, and then read history that went alongside it, the actual history that was happening, because there's so much more, there's so much texture to be had. And find that niche that hasn't been filled yet. as I have. I reached into Great Britain. I reached into England. It hadn't, apart from what was going on in London in 1633 and 1634, the novels, not the period of history, nobody had much touched England, and that's what I'm doing. So learn, study, think, extrapolate.
So is everyone enthusiastic and positive about the changes she's introducing?
Oh, no, no. There are so many people for whom inertia is the way forward. They
It,
don't want to change anything. People don't really change over time. They just have different circumstances. They may live in hovels, they may live in castles, they may live in houses with central heating. But basically, people are the same. They don't want to do something unknown because the unknown scares them. Most people will never go and do something really innovative and different. They'll follow the crowd, they'll do what their parents all did. But the other 10%, the goats as opposed to the sheep, they're going to be the movers and shakers. They're going to be the ones who change things. And there will be a lot of protest until the sheep see how it benefits them. And that's a great fundamental part of my story.
I won't ask you to give the villain away before the book, but
No, please don't.
you know, there's quite a nasty villain in it. Ring of Fire also has some wonderful villains. Sometimes, like usually, it's harder to figure out if they're the villain or not,
And
or at this point, alive or not. But anyhow, yeah. Moving off that to your other writings, you're really quite well known for your humor books and your humor series, and my favorite probably is one that you just did one of, and it's the Wolfpack book, Tactics of Mistake. You want to explain what that's about? That should appeal to Ring of Fire readers. It's got the same tongue-in-cheek cynicism.
Yes, Strong Arm Tactics is the first of the Wolfpack books. There was always meant to be more. There will be more in all my copious spare time. And they feature a troop of misfits. They're the zero crew. They're the ones that the military brass cannot find a good excuse for actually demobbing, but they don't necessarily trust them particularly. The punishment detail. And into this mess comes a young man named David Wolf, who is a political hot potato. And that he is put with the punishment crew because they don't get any high level assignments. They don't get any high profile exposure. No one wants anything bad to happen to him because his father is a mob boss. He comes from a long line of people who make things happen. He's extremely connected. In fact, plastered to his skin and almost never removed from it is a little computer card that contains all the favors that people have owed his family for generations. And he can call them in if necessary. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the family, but he often finds that it's the one thing he can do. They are given an assignment. It's a cream puff assignment. What could possibly go wrong? To retrieve an item from what is essentially a planet-sized amusement park. It would be Disney World if it were in fact a world populated by artificial intelligence robots and puppets that are run by incredibly experienced puppeteers, and they're invaded. So naturally, things are not going to go as they want them to, and they have to figure out clever ways to defeat the enemy, and there is an enemy, and fulfill their mission, and get a little bit of honor for this very, very disrespected troop of misfits.
And just to get a preview, who takes part in the final combat along with the invading aliens? Who do they fight them with?
Puppets, life-sized puppets. There's tons of them. An experienced puppeteer on Wingle World can operate up to 9 puppets at a time, the really experienced ones. The junior puppeteers can probably run 1 or 2, but it becomes their army, in the same way that the people during the Civil War and during the Western expansion would put up hats and rifles along the top of a fort to make it look like that there was an entire force. All of a sudden, the small troop that David commands suddenly looks enormously increased. And it's a lot of fun. I had a bunch of fun with it.
Yes, it's hard not to picture Mickey Mouse with an AK, but in any case, you write a lot of humor, mostly science fiction and fantasy humor, and we'll get into some of the others. But what is different about science fiction and fantasy humor from, say, just a stand-up comic or ordinary humor that we might run into otherwise, Animal House or something? What makes it what's unique about it? What makes it different to write?
It's the same thing that is in any science fiction or fantasy story. It's the science fiction or fantasy idea, that which changes the world. If you write a story that is set in a science fiction universe, say on another planet, and you could set it anywhere else and have the same things happen, then you haven't written a science fiction story, you've written something with science fiction tropes. That's not science fiction. It has to change the world in a way that could only be in this particular story, in this particular milieu. For example, if there's time travel involved, if time travel needs to be involved not only in the story, but in the solution thereof. If you have genetic engineering, if you have a interaction between species that is unique and can't be expressed in purely human terms, then you have a science fiction or fantasy idea. But you get one per story. But if you suddenly have psychic cats and talking dolphins and friendly aliens and animate machines, then you have to find a way to tie that together at the end. Otherwise, you have a farce. And while farces are absolutely perfectly wonderful storytelling techniques, it gets a little bit hairy, and you have to find a way to tie that together at the end, in the same way that you would tell any other story. But when it comes to humor, that's on top of an actual science fiction or fantasy story. So it might not be focused in the same way, since humor stories tend to be smaller tales than a big one. In the same way that the myth adventures, which I presume we will talk about in a little while, they are the anti-Tolkien, the anti-Eddings, the anti-Lord Dunsany, because instead of talking about things that could end the world, you're talking about trying to obtain the most hideous object in the universe as a birthday gift for one of your friends.
So, for example, the myth, is a lot of it, the premise is humorous, or how does this work?
Oh, yes. Well, you can have a humorous story that is lightly humorous, laugh out loud, funny, quiet, satisfied chuckles. It depends on your style, or if you're versatile enough, many different styles of humor. The premise, as far as the characters are concerned, is purely serious. It's their lives we're dealing with. But to us, it's going to look very funny that they're doing something that is not very serious to us at all, or even ridiculous. And yet, it's their real lives. So it might be life and death to them, but death by 1,000 pies is going to look very funny to the reader.
Okay. You mentioned the Myth Adventures book. Perhaps you should go. How did you end up writing Myth Adventures books? They were started by Robert Asprin initially.
Yes. And another stranger whom I have never met. Way back when I was still in college, I read Another Fine Myth. The thing that people have told me about the Myth Adventures is that they came along when they really, really needed them, some sort of cheering up. Because at the base of these stories is a friendship that is unbreakable.
What's the premise?
The premise is that a young apprentice magician who is taking lessons from his master, Garkin, in order to go back and use it to break into houses and steal things, suddenly finds himself face to face with a master magician from another dimension. And the two of them are suddenly forced to band together to save their own lives. Because as a surprise, the two master magicians, Garkin and Oz, old buddies, terrific friends, used to summon one another to scare their respective apprentices. Garkin looks like one of us. He is from the dimension of Claw, which makes him a clod. And Oz is from Perv, which if you like them means he's a pervect. And if you don't like him, he's a pervert. And there's just enough truth in pervert to make it real. So Garkin says that he does not like the way that Skeev is thinking about using magic, that magic is a terribly serious thing. So he begins the magic passes to summon a demon into his world to show Skeev, which is our protagonist, exactly how serious magic is. So he begins to lay the groundwork for it. And just as this master magician comes into the world, Garkin is shot dead by a couple of imp assassins with armor-piercing quarrels who were just outside the window, leaving him face to face with Oz, who looks like a creature out of Nightmare with green scaly skin and huge batwing ears and long, sharp teeth. But as a surprise to his old buddy, Garkin decided as a joke to take away Oz's powers. And now that he's dead, we have a master magician with no power and an apprentice magician who doesn't know what he's doing. So it's necessary for the two of them to get together and work together. Now, because magic exists in this world, that's the fantasy idea. And moving forward, they run into a variety of magical experiences that could not happen in just a human-to-human story. So they go on the run, they have to solve a problem to survive, one after another. And going from being thrown together out of necessity, they kind of discovered that they like each other, that they can become good friends. It's not the easiest friendship in the world, but it is a sound one. And I think that is very appealing to people because there's so much that is conditional in this world, that things you can't count on that you hope that you could over time. But Oz and Skeev are always buddies and always will be.
Okay. So how did you get involved in that universe?
Well, once upon a time, a fellow that I was going to marry, who happens to be on the other side of this screen, whose our cat tail is flapping him in the face, was an old friend of Bob Asprin's and said, why don't we go visit Bob and his wife, Lynn Abbey, the two who are the editors of Thieves' World at the time, and Bob, who is the author of the Myth Adventures. So off we went to Ann Arbor to meet them. And Bob and I hit it off absolutely like peanut butter and jelly, just wonderfully well. We found we had an awful lot in common. We both loved show tunes, we both adored cats, and Lynn and Bob could not have been nicer to me. They were fantastic fun. Over time, Bob ran into a terrible thing. He ran into too much success and had a bout of writer's block out of pure fear. How do you follow up getting on the New York Times bestseller list? And he did it by shutting down. So I was persuaded by you and by a couple of other people to write a book with Bob. So we created License Invoked, which is a spy story set in New Orleans, spies, magic, and rock and roll. And it had nothing to do with either one of our own series, any of our previous works. It was an entirely original book. And we had a really wonderful time with it. Bob was at the time up to the end of book 10 of the Myth Adventures. And he had 2 more to go on the original Dawning Starblaze contract. And he said, when he finished with those 12, he wanted me to work with him on future Myth Adventures books. And we did. We wrote 5 novels together and a short story collection and had enormous fun doing it. So I was really privileged. From reading the books in college, I never dreamed that I'd meet him, let alone work with him. And I miss him terribly because we had so much fun plotting those books. I love the characters. They live in my head now, and you have no idea how annoying it is to have to pay the green guy's bar bill all the time. So Bob trusted me in a way that I never expected. I am honored by that trust, and I will not let him down. The characters are what they should be. They are very wonderful characters, very well-rounded. Their relationships are interesting, that they're worth exploring further. And you can't help but love them. How can you not like a baby dragon whose entire being is dedicated to protecting his human, whom he considers to be too dumb to live, and the brother and sister pairing of Troll and Trollop, who are from Trollia. The Myth Adventures, I should point out for people who are beginning to pick up on it, is full of terrible puns.
Thank you.
The dimensions are all puns. So you have people who look like us are from Clod, that makes us Clods. People who are from Trollia are Trolls or Trollops, depending on their sex. Imps are from Imper. Kobolds are from Kobol. They are generally computer programmers, and so on. So occasionally you'll come across a new one as we came up with it and added it to the books. And that was half the fun. People also comment that at the chapter headers of many of the chapters in the books, you find something that refers to a famous person and something that they might have said, although they're all made up. Like, I'm putting the band back together, signed R. Hood. Well, Bob jealously guarded doing the quotes on the chapter heads but to himself, and I only ever got to do them after we lost Bob. But for a piece of trivia, except for one book in which there's a mix, all the chapter heads are only on chapters in which Skeeve appears. So there's a bit of trivia for you, and if it's missing a chapter quote, that's why.
And is there any Tuckerization in the books, Bob, and you do, or Bob did?
That was from the very, very beginning. Yes, there are a number of Tuckerizations. Garkin is an old friend of Dr. Bob Passavoy. There are many, many other people. If you look at the original Kelly Freas cover for Another Fine Myth, you'll see that not only were they Tuckerized in the book, but they were Tuckerized on the covers. So you'll find the odd one here and there. I have occasionally auctioned off a Tuckerization for the Myth Adventures for charity. People who give away Tuckerizations, appearances in a book either under a pseudonym, an anagram of your actual name or your actual name, depending, are not for profit. They are generally for charity, either for a conventions charity or another greater need like the American Heart Association or the diabetics, or many other charities that could use a little boost. And it's been a lot of fun to fulfill those. I'm very fond of the one that I put into Myth Chief. That is a very nice young man who is a teacher somewhere in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he loves his Tuckerization. There have been Tuckerizations that we hope that the original people never recognize. But that was Bob being playful.
Yes, I remember Richard and Wendy as the Wolf Writers.
Yes, the Wolf Writers. In fact, they were wolves and they wrote books.
Werewolves.
Yes, exactly.
But one of them was tall. Anyhow, one of the things that you do, you teach the writers workshop at Dragon Con, and you've done private writers workshops for a few particular groups, etc. Mm-hmm. When you are teaching writers, since we talked about getting into the Ring of Fire series as well, what are some of the key lessons? What's the first key lesson you tell writers when you're reviewing their manuscripts? Say about the first section. A writer's workshop is she goes in and she reads the manuscript, she critiques it, and then gives writing hints based upon the manuscript. And it can be 7,000 words like at the workshop, or an entire manuscript in some cases, entire book. But you do a section on the start of the book, or the start of the story.
Well, there are two things that I would like to stress. One is you need to get the editor's attention immediately. And the editor is not only your first reader, but your greatest ally. So you want to make sure that she is interested in the book. And for that, you have to have a narrative hook. Years ago, I sat in on a workshop by a wonderful man named Alan Wold, who lives in the Southeast United States. And he teaches this workshop, and now I teach it too, to experiment with writing a hook for your story or your novel. And his workshop is 100 words or fewer. Only 100 words. You're going to have to count them to make sure that you stay with that. Why such a short thing? Because in a short story, you don't have a lot of real estate. You need to get people into the story as quickly as possible. So the ideal hook sets the book in time and space, tells people where they are, introduces a character, not necessarily your main character, and an action of some kind taken by the character or taken upon the character. And it must create in the reader's mind a question, which can only be answered by going on to read the rest of the manuscript. That's it. For example, John Scalzi, who was the president of SUFWA for a term, began his best-selling novel, Old Man's War, with 2 sentences. On my 75th birthday, I did 2 things. I visited my wife's grave, and I joined the army. So it tells you a lot of things right away. It introduces the character, the main character, who it's in the first person is a little difficult to describe oneself, but you know something about him right away. He is most likely male. He was married. He is widowed. He is 75 years old, and yet he's about to join the army. So you suggest, this suggests that it is a science fiction story. It suggests that it's set in the future. But it includes all of those things, the action and all, and it very fundamentally says, what else is going on in the story? Why are these things happening? I must know more. Let me go on and read. So that's incredibly important to get the editor and the readers invested in continuing to read your story. Now, sometimes you can take up to an entire chapter. Robin Hobb's Assassin's Apprentice, the entire first chapter is the hook, and it ends with the actual barb, the hook on the very last line. And I won't give that away because it's a very good book. But you're reading through it and you're getting a great deal of background information. You're being introduced to a number of characters. And then suddenly she sets the hook and you can no longer escape. You must go on to read the rest of the book. The other thing that I always tell writing students is continuity is your God. If you have a spell that works one way on page 26, it darn well work the same way on page 326, unless you have a good explanation for that alteration. Physics needs to work the same way throughout. And the reader will stop trusting you if you defy their expectations without explanation. If suddenly there is a power surge and that changes the equations, if you suddenly introduce something that has been explained that it does a certain thing, you don't have to go through all the nuts and bolts and screws of how something works, as long as your characters know that it does work, or that when they turn it on, it in fact does continue to work, or it does what it says on the box. So keep in mind that continuity keeps your readers from losing interest in what you're doing. If you lie to them, they won't trust you anymore, and suspension of disbelief is vital for the readers of fiction.
What are some of the most consistent problems? You've been doing this for what, nearly a decade?
I have been doing it. I just finished with workshop number 10 for Dragon Con.
What are the most common things new writers have to watch for?
A lack of description. There's so often that it's very much obviously that it's going on in their heads, in the writer's heads, but they don't put it down on paper. You need to give the readers the view of the world that you have envisioned, the detail that is there, that obviously you have in your mind, but you have not put it down on the page. If it's not on the page, then you have 2 voices, possibly more, just talking in a blank white room. That's not interesting. We're not doing radio theater here. We are, in fact, trying to write a book in which you're creating an entire world for the reader's mind to inhabit and to enjoy. So tell them what it looks like. What do the people look like? What's the weather like? And you need to introduce sense words. So smell, touch, taste, very much sight. But you begin with sight and you add the other things to it. As David Gerald has said, if you don't automatically put in your sense words on each page, go back and do it. Go back and put them in so that your reader feels the world in the same way that you do.
How important are cats?
Oh, cats are incredibly important.
Just ask them.
Yes, I will. Hey, Minx.
No, well, patience. All right. You've talked about the various writings and that. Um, you're working on, by the way, we spoke of it, another myth book.
That's right.
At the moment. And what's that one about, and what pun is the name?
Well, since Bob passed away, I've written two. One was called Myth Quoted, which is about the election that would not end. So it's important to the day and the time right now. The second one was Myth Fits. And the third one that I am working on is called Ain't Myth Behavin'. So it is by the suggestion of its title of the Fats Domino song. It's about music and how things are happening all over the place wherever this young musician goes to perform. She is not to blame, obviously, because she's on stage at the time that countless house breaks are going on. So who's doing it? What's going on? Why is it always following this young musician? So it's up to Skeeve and the other people of Myth Inc. to solve the problem, figure it out, and have a good time along the way.
Okay. You do a series of stories in which the alien's in a rather strange location. How difficult is that to put together versus your normal short story? And what am I talking about? To explain what I'm talking about. And I think that I don't think I could do that. But talk about putting those together.
This is so fundamentally science fiction that I just love having created that. I have Detective Sergeant Dina Malone, who lives in the Tri-City area, which is essentially Newark, New York, and at this point, I think Hartford, Connecticut. In the future, far enough forward that we have flying cars, the flying cars that we were promised from way back. As far
I'm waiting.
Yeah, where's my flying car? And she is a detective sergeant of police. She runs into a murder victim who is also the host for an alien species, for one member of an alien species, who are long, skinny, worm-like creatures who are about 1 meter in length and a little over an inch in diameter. But they're very intelligent. They come from a sea world that has a warm oceans that approximate the temperature of the human body. So some bright spark figured out that if they give them communication devices, these aliens could exist in the peritoneum of hosts. So you would have an alien living inside your body who would communicate with you by an implant that they have on the back of their heads, along with a bracelet that you would wear, and also through bone conduction. So you have no escape from this being once it's inside you. And because the alien is in danger of death, and she is the right blood type and right body makeup, they suggest that she gets to be the next host of this creature who, by the way, witnessed the murder. So this gives a whole new meaning to Witness Protection Program. So she's, and at the end of the story, this is not particularly a spoiler. I think you could figure it out that he's not going anywhere. He's going to continue to live inside of Dina. And I've written 7 stories so far with Dr. Katank. He is, in fact, a very highly educated person on his own planet. And each one of them is a science fiction story. So I have what looks like a suicide and is actually a terrible murder because he wears computerized contact lenses and they were hacked. So I have a lot of fun coming up with the devices that are used in each of the stories. And so it's legitimately science fiction. I think they're a lot of fun. They are funny. One of them was kind of dark because that was the theme of the anthology this year. They are all featured in Unidentified Funny Objects, edited by Alex Schwartzman, which UFO 8 just came out, and the eighth one, seventh story is in the eighth book.
Okay, thank you. How hard is it getting to come up with something that no one else has done? A lot.
Well, you do the best you can. There is almost always going to be an analog to an idea that you come up with. There's a I think it's a James Schmidt story that approximates in a way Malone and Katank's relationship. It's called The Only Neat Thing to Do, about a girl who finds that she has a parasite in her who is an intelligent alien. So in a way, it's not an entirely new idea, but what I do with it is going to be different. And that is the truth about every idea that you come up with. If you find that somebody else has written something similar, your story is most likely to be very, very different from the way that the author you find took it. We're going to have different stories about talking cats. We're going to have different stories about animate AI robots. We're all going to have a different take on it where we steer it. And you want to have it as far as you can from the original source material. For example, lots of people would like to write licensed fiction, such as things set in the Star Wars universe, Star Trek universe, Doctor Who, you name it. But those are very well protected by an impenetrable wall of lawyers. So it behooves you to write your own story as best you can and stay away from other people's universes.
The Gazette, Granville Gazette and others start as basically fan fiction. Did your career start with any fan fiction? What part does fan fiction play in the scenario today of becoming a writer?
I don't think that it has much use for its practice. Fan fiction is great practice, and it's an outlet for your feelings, for an idea that you may come up with, that and also expanding the universes of some media or book series that you just loved and could not believe that there weren't more stories. It's the way that the Pern universe, Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders Pern, the many people who belong to the Weir clubs, they loved Anne's books and wanted there to be more stories, and stories that involved people who were, wow, just like them, except with dragons. So they began to write their own fan fiction. The owner of the universe is the arbiter on whether or not you are allowed to write fan fiction and or publish it. And if they say no, they mean no. And they have to defend their copyright, which can mean that they have to send lawyers after you. But there are polite ways to deal with it. Anne allowed people to write fan fiction in Pern as long as they did not involve her main characters, except peripherally, references to them or seeing them at gathers and so on. And that she was never expected to read any of it, because that way lies copyright infringement lawsuits. So that was her way of dealing with it. Star Trek winks at the many incarnations of fan fiction, as long as people don't try to write it professionally. That said, in the very early days of Star Trek novels, there was such a demand for more after the first 4 or 5 were published, that Paramount and Pocketbook sent out a cry for more fan fiction. Anything that you had that was novel length that could possibly be published as a Star Trek book, because, oh my God, we want them now. And that gave rise to some really interesting crossovers, especially Barbara Hambly, who was a wonderful writer, had a fanfic novel called Ishmael, in which it was noted that the man who played Sarek on television, Mark Leonard, is also the man who played Aaron in a television program called Here Come the Brides. So you had a Star Trek crossover with Here Come the Brides. And this would never happen again, but it was published. So there are exceptions to the rules, and they usually come along at an early point. On the other hand, if you love something and you want to write in it, there are websites galore now, including fanfiction.net, which I think is the largest. You can write and publish your story on it for no money. You cannot profit from somebody else's universe. But people who love that particular universe can search yours out and read it. I know there's a tremendous amount of Harry Potter fan fiction. Our goddaughter actually writes some of it. So live it up, enjoy it. But remember, that sandbox does not belong to you. If you want to publish for money, you have to write your own books.
Beth will appreciate the plug there. Beth Bromley, in case you're looking it up. All right, so to get back to the Ring of Fire universe and the characters and things in it, how much do you feel that you can change a historical character? How much? One of the big things I watch in it is how much the various characters are warped by the new environment.
Oh, that kind of change is going to fundamentally alter their worldview. They are suddenly face to face with these loud, boisterous, clean, healthy people who came out of nowhere, literally nowhere, and took over an entire province of Thuringia. The way you would change people is the same way you would change anybody else. You show them what you can do. You invite them to experience it with you, or they see what you're doing and they're jealous of it and they want to experience it themselves, or they're terrified of it and want to destroy it. So it depends on the personality of the characters themselves. And the more historical research you do, the more you're going to understand how you can bring a character into it and how you can't. You're not going to change, for example, Oliver Cromwell's religious feelings because he was a deeply religious man. You're not going to make Cardinal Richelieu into a cream puff just because you want him to be. He has to be the historical man because people will call you on that. Anybody who actually existed, who was an important being, likely has some historical contemporary writings or statements about them, or notations in the annals or in guild transcripts and so on, guild meeting transcripts. And if you can pick up on the personality from that, you need to be consistent. Again, continuity.
Okay. In the Ring of Fire, the entire series, it spans continents. If you weren't doing England and you're going to do somewhere else in the world that hadn't been done yet, they just added the West Indies and stuff. What calls out for Ring of Fire needs to have to the appearance of the Americans has to affect this? Is there another part of the world, another group that you think Ring of Fire would be fun to play with in it?
Well, I'm already having fun with what I'm doing. I would have to read more of the books to see what other people have picked up on. I love what my fellow writers are doing in it, and oh my God, there's some fantastic ideas. The Barbie craze just tickled me to pieces. That they had a buying and selling of Barbies in the same way that the tulip craze took place in the Netherlands.
Hopefully without the bubble.
It's a very limited supply. They have appeal in the same way that the tulips did. The rarity of perhaps a limited edition Barbie. And suddenly these teenagers are cornering the market and becoming very, very rich because everybody must have the newest and latest trend. Humans love trends. Humans love fads. And Barbies, to use a phrase that I really, really hate seeing in fiction, is no exception.
Okay. So if someone's going to write in the Ring of Fire, in a few sentences to wrap this up, what advice would you give them other than having known Eric for 25, 30 years like we have, and being his friend, what would you advise them to do? What would you advise them not to do?
Read the series, know it well. If you are interested in writing in a milieu that somebody else has already claimed, I would send a proposal to Eric and copying in the person whose milieu you are invading. People can get very territorial about it because they've invested a lot of time and care and possibly years upon years of writing in it. If you have a wonderful invention that you can extrapolate from the year 2000 technology, which is approximately all they had when they went back, send your proposal. But my suggestion, if you want to get involved in the universe, is come up with a short story that is set in the time. Very most likely how the advent of the Americans changed the world for downtimers in a particular area. If you know the world well, you'll know where the battles went through. You'll know where the committees of correspondence are starting to make their voices heard. Find a place where you can tell your story and propose it to the Grantville Gazette. The chances are of being able to write a novel in the universe until you're familiar with it, until you're known in it, is more unlikely. But Eric has hired from the ranks of people who have written in the Grantville Gazette and allowed them to go ahead and expand their vision. It's been a tremendously interesting ride. There are at least 60 people who are involved in writing 16 to 32 fiction, some of whom only write short stories. But the opportunity is there. This is a great opportunity for a beginning writer to explore and then participate.
Okay. And I think on that note, we thank you for appearing at the Ring of Fire Con, ROFCon this year. And thank you, Jody Lynn Nye, for all the advice and help.
Thank you so much for interviewing me.